and a man who was a sports writer in Philadelphia, still is a sports writer, has written this book, and his name is Mike Sielski, and he's joining us now on Fox Sports Radio. Michael, first of all, good Sunday to you. How you doing?
I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me on.
You kidding me? Michael, let me tell you this straight up. It's our honor to have you on. When someone writes a book like this, it's getting the promotional legs about it that it's getting. And as I and John have said earlier on this show, we say it every weekend, we get to sit here and talk sports. Great. We love football and baseball and basketball and hockey. Great. But this kind of thing puts what we do for a living, or what these men do for sport for a living, in perspective, and you kind of grasped it from two high school kids who go on to become heroes, one who's with us still and one who's not. Mike, let's go back to the genesis of this book. Tell us how it came to you to write it.
Well, the first job I got in sports writing was at the newspaper that's based in Doylestown, the town where the book is set. And I was covering high school sports. I was covering Friday night football games in the town. And the town had two high schools, CB West and CB East, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And each of these guys played on one of those teams. And at the time, the rivalry was probably the best in Pennsylvania, which, I mean, as you guys know, Pennsylvania's turned out Joe Montana, Joe Namath, Dan Marino, Jim Kelly, John Unitas. It's a football hotbed. And so I covered these two guys and these two teams for that year, and moved on with my life, and they moved on with theirs. And then 9 years later, I found out that by reading a newspaper article that one of them had enlisted in the Army, become an Army Ranger, and had been killed in action over in Iraq. And, he was Colby Umbrellas, the person I'm talking about, and he was really the first person I'd ever known to be harmed in war in any way. And I was curious as to how he got to the point of being an 18-year-old kid who played high school football to being the kind of man who would fight and die for his country. So once I read that article, I started doing some more research into Colby's life, found out that Brian Buckley had taken a similar path, and I just thought this is a story that needs to be told.
Well, I mean, this is obviously a tragedy that probably really shook Doylestown, knowing the kind of community that it is, me being a South Jersey and East Coast guy. But talk a little bit about authoring a book versus writing a sports column. I mean, it's two totally different things. And also, you're authoring a book that almost demands a certain justice be done. I mean, there is a little bit of pressure on you to really do justice for this story. And tell me just a little bit about how tough it's been to really author such a good story.
Well, I mean, it's different. I mean, you guys in your intro were very prescient about the difference between being able to talk about sports and write about sports, which is basically games that boys can play, versus doing what these two guys did, which is, one of them became a Marine, the other one became an Army Ranger, and they both end up putting themselves in harm's way in the desert in the Middle East. You were right. The book carried, John, a grave responsibility to be accurate, to be thorough, to make sure I got the stories right, and to be fair in telling that story. I mean, the war in Iraq is very controversial, has been for years, and I didn't want anybody who read the book to think I had an agenda, in writing it. All I wanted to do was tell the story of these two guys' lives. I mean, they were unique and ordinary at the very same time. They could have been any two guys from any small town in America who grew up playing high school football and decided, you know what, the lessons I learned playing football helped me become the kind of man who would do brave things later in life. And I just thought that was a story that was worth telling, that people should, need to know about and be reminded of. And you're right. It's different because it's just a different style of writing. You end up having to do more research and take more time to do it. But more than anything else, you realize you're not writing about the little games that boys can play.
Joining us here on Fox Sports Radio is Mike Sielski. The book is now out, called Fading Echoes, a true story of rivalry and brotherhood from the football field to the fields of honor. Mike, on that last mention you just had about bringing the things you've learned from the football field to the battlefield, more or less, what did you learn of the similarities between the game of football, the team aspect, not the game itself, but the team of it, and the team we find out these men embarked in, both in their chosen drives with the U.S. military?
Well, for these two guys, I think there was a direct connection between the work that they did, growing up and playing high school football, and then, working through the training of the military and what they experienced in Iraq. I'm not saying that, high school football necessarily turns everybody into a great soldier. What I am saying is that for these two guys, there was a direct connection there, that the discipline that they learned and honed when they were in high school playing football helped them become a better Marine and a better soldier later in life. Now, we've had times in our history where, in the early 20th century where, the entire American military thought that every soldier should be trained in sports because, it would help them be better soldiers and better military men. Obviously, that's not totally true for everybody. You don't need to be a great football player early in life to be able to be involved in the military, and sometimes the comparisons go way over the top. But for these two guys, there was a direct connection there.
Well, Mike, Publishers Weekly calls Fading Echoes a Friday Night Lights tale that unfolds into a moving study of war's transforming effect on individuals, families, and communities. And what I wanted to ask you is, you talked earlier about how you didn't want to have an agenda going into the book. What were your real aspirations for the book, though? I mean, was it really just to tell the story? Was it just to share a tale? Is this really to gain perspective on things, and really just to share the story of how such, sports turns into war and how it all really comes together in community?
I think that's a lot of it. I think I wanted to tell a story that showed at its best what sports could do, for somebody. And for these two guys, playing high school football in this small town and in this community had a hugely beneficial impact to them. It helped turn them into the men that they became. And the other interesting dynamic was just the town of Doylestown. Usually when you think of a high school football hotbed, you think of a town in the Texas Prairie or a steel town in western Pennsylvania. Doylestown is neither of those things. It's a very affluent town. It's got a lot of boutiques and high-end restaurants. And that was interesting to me, too, was that how did this town become kind of a hotbed for high school football and produce these kinds of guys? And, I just thought there were a lot of interesting elements to the story, and that it broke a lot of the different stereotypes that we think of when we think of high school football, when we think of guys who went into the military. You always hear people say, well, guys go into the military because they have no other choice in life. Well, these guys both went to prestigious universities. Colby went to Johns Hopkins. Brian went to Villanova. They could have done or been anything, and they decided to fight for their country, which I think is a pretty brave and admirable thing.
And then Michael, that comment leads me to my final question, and that is this. How did Doylestown react to what you were doing? How have they reacted since the book, and how are the parents reacting?
The parents have been very positive about the book. I think it was a little difficult for Brian and Colby's mothers to read, as you might expect, because it's hard to read about what your son is doing in war. I didn't set out to make these guys angels. I wanted the reader to get a sense of who they really were as people. I didn't want to god them up or anything like that. The town obviously took a big blow with Colby's death. Another young man from the town, a Marine, had been killed in Iraq 4 days before Colby. So it was a 1-2 punch that the town sustained. It was really tough. But the town has been very positive in its reception of the book. It was there's an independent bookstore in Doylestown, and the book was the biggest seller there last year. So it's been pretty beneficial all around, I think. I hope.
The name of the book is Fading Echoes, a true story of rivalry and brotherhood from the football field to the fields of honor. The author is Mike Sielski. He's with us right now. And Michael, on this Sunday, thank you for coming in and telling the story to more people who don't know it yet. And may more people, because of this interview, get out and read it. And not only learn about these young men and their town and their family, but just about young men and women in general who are doing this every single day while we sit here and talk sport.
Thank you. That was one of my goals in writing this thing, was just to give some people pause and tell a good story about a couple of guys who are worth admiring, and I appreciate you guys having me on.
Mike, thanks for your time, man.
All right, thanks a lot, Mike.
All right, take care.